Let's go to the survey. Rick, let's go ahead and walk through some of these questions. And let's talk a little bit about where we're at. We're going to close out the national debt clock. You've kind of seen that. And we can go ahead and take a look at this, this survey. Now, you don't have to answer these questions out loud, but I want you to, if you have a piece of a pen or paper with you, if you've got your survey in front of you, you can kind of work with me as we go along. Which of the following will the federal government spend the most on in 2012, in the 2012 U.S. federal budget? Is it our national defense? Is it health care, Medicare and Medicaid, interest on the public debt, foreign aid, Social Security, unemployment compensation, earmarks and pork barrel spending, or welfare? Which of the following will the federal government spend the most on in 2012 U.S. federal budget?
Defense is very close to health care.
What's that?
Defense is almost exactly.
Yeah.
Same as number 2.
Yeah, very, very close. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Healthcare is number 1. Healthcare is number 1. Consumes roughly 17 to 20% of the nation's GDP. And because the government is heavily involved in healthcare through a bunch of different programs, the number 1 thing we spend money on, the federal treasury, is healthcare. That's the biggest thing. Question number 2. Our gross domestic product is an economic term that measures the size of America's economy in dollars. As you may know, the United States carries a national debt. By the end of 2012, the total federal debt is projected to be approximately what percent of the United States GDP? Now, GDP is the total amount of our overall production, our total amount of everything that we produce in this country. Is it 50%, 66%, 75%, 90%, or 100%? Let's go ahead to the next slide and we'll show you. It's 100% of GDP. 100%. Our nation's GDP is projected to be 15.2 trillion. In rough numbers, you saw the debt clock running at 15.7 trillion. So we're just a little bit over 100% today. And so we now have a debt that's as large as our entire productivity.
Oh, okay.
What's that?
We're asking folks not to
But this
the event.
the sources here, I'll be happy to provide all the sources for everybody. But we know what the GDP is. It's 15.2 trillion. We know what the national debt is. It's 15.7
Well, we're asking
trillion.
folks not to.
So it's fairly simple math to come up with these numbers. If anybody wants all the sourcing for this, if you would just let me know after the meeting, talk to one of my staff, give us your email, and we'll send you all the sources for all this information. Okay? Good. Okay, let's go to the next question. Question number 3. In 2010, the U.S. government borrowed about how much of every dollar it spent. Did it borrow a penny of every dollar? 10 cents of a dollar? 25 cents of a dollar? 33 cents out of a dollar? Or 40 cents out of a dollar?
40.
Okay. Let's go ahead to the next slide. It's 40 cents. Now, obviously, if GDP grows and tax revenues go up, that percent will go down. As revenue goes up, the percent of money that we're borrowing goes down. But right now, as of 2010, we're borrowing about 40 cents. This year, it looks like we're going to borrow about 33 to 34 cents of every dollar. So every single dollar that we're spending, we're borrowing roughly a third of it now. Let's go to the next question. In 2010, what was the total amount of the federal deficit? The total amount of the federal deficit. All right? And the deficit is the annual amount of money that we're spending above and beyond our revenue. The national debt is the effective accumulative amount of debt we built up over time. All right? So, did we have a balanced budget last year? Did we spend $500 billion in debt? Did we spend $1 trillion in debt? 1.3 trillion or 2.0 trillion? Yeah, it's 1.3 trillion. Now you might have on your paper 1.5 trillion. There's 1.3 trillion. So that's how much we spent in deficit. That's how much we added to the national debt in 2010. And this year it looks like we'll be on track for the 4th consecutive year. According to the White House Office of Management and Budget, waste, fraud, and abuse accounted for approximately how much of the 2009 federal budget, which totaled $3.1 trillion. So we had spending at 3.1 trillion in 2009. OMB said one of these numbers was how much went to waste, fraud, and abuse. How much money the federal government waste.
My question is, why is there so much Medicare fraud? You know, Medicare wouldn't be in trouble if doctors wouldn't have their accounts. You go into a doctor's office with a sore toe and they want an X-ray all over.
That's not true.
I will come back and answer that question. That'll be the first question I take after we go through this survey, because I think you're onto something. And so, Kyle or Jackie, remind me to come back to that question. Go ahead and write down your best guess. It's $100 billion. So I will often hear from constituents, you know, if we would just get rid of all the waste, fraud, and abuse in Washington, D.C., we could balance the budget. And so, but that's still about 8%, isn't it? It's still a big number. This is a huge number. And so we need to get at this number. Go to the next question. Eliminating all waste, fraud, and abuse reported by the House the White House Office of Management and Budget would cut what percentage of the deficit? We just talked about that a second ago. Let's go to the next slide. 7%. Even if we could get rid of all of it, that's what we would say. And you're never going to be able to get rid of all of it. $3.5 trillion organization is a big organization with lots and lots of employees. Like any other large organization, there are employees in those organizations that will try to cheat the system. And there will be American citizens that will try to take advantage and scam the system. And so it's difficult. Let's go ahead to the next question. If we were to cut all earmarks and pork barrel spending from the budget, let's say we just eliminated all those special bridges to nowhere, and we got rid of all of that kind of stuff, where every single bill had to pass on its own merit, nobody could kind of buy a congressman. How much is it? 17 billion, 57 billion, 107 billion, 207 billion, or 507 billion? Huh? Yeah, think about that. Let's go to the next slide and show the number. It's 17 billion. That's the pork barrel spend. That's the earmark spend. Now, in 2011, there were no earmarks allowed. So there were no earmarks. No special backroom deals or set-asides were allowed under the House rules. And some people said, well, how come you haven't passed highway bill yet, transportation bill? Well, what we're finding out is how difficult it is to pass a highway bill and transportation bill when the chairman of the committee can't buy off members of Congress to vote for their bill. There's no earmarks. There were 6,000 earmarks in the last highway bill. No earmarks in this highway bill. And so now there's all kinds of reasons for people not to vote against it, and so things just kind of stop. And so it's fascinating. You all would think this is just stupid, right? You should vote on a bill because it's either good or bad. Not how it always works. In fact, let me just use this as an example. On every piece of legislation, can you all kind of see my pen, what I'm doing here? I got some folks behind the post, the pillars here. Every piece of legislation that gets to the floor of the House, gets to the floor of the House as a result of some form of compromise throughout the committee process. So I could actually write a bill and put it into the hopper, and then the Speaker of the House assigned it to a committee of jurisdiction that I might not even sit on. The chairman then takes that bill and they do what's called a markup, and they amend the bill. So they could bring a bill out of committee that's got my name on it that I wrote, that has now been amended and doesn't remotely say what I wanted it to. So then it goes to the floor of the House where, under an open rule, it can be amended again from the floor. And so ultimately, you see these television commercials, well, he voted for it before he voted against it. Well, that's why. Because it gets amended through the process as different members want to adjust and amend the bill. In some cases, the chairman of the committee can put an amendment in the bill. It's called an amendment in the form of a substitute, and actually substitute his bill or her bill for my bill. But you know whose name's on that bill? My name's on that bill. So I look at every piece of legislation, and as I measure it, I say to myself, and I ask this question: does this bill make things a little bit better, a lot better, or completely better? And if it does, I'm likely to vote yes, because the fulcrum shifts the weight. But there might be some things in there that I don't like. But there's not enough of those to offset the things that we do like. But every piece of legislation I vote for has got things that I like and things that I don't like. And you've asked me to weigh those things, to study those things and find out. And sometimes there's just too much things in there that I can't vote for. And sometimes it may just be one thing, but it's that one thing is so overwhelming. I'll give you one example, then we'll go back to our slides. Recently I voted no on the National Defense Authorization Bill. It was the bill that actually funded our entire military, and I voted no on it. And people question, why did you vote no on that bill? Because in that bill, buried in the language in that bill, it allowed your government to arrest U.S. citizens without a warrant and without the right of habeas corpus and put them in a military tribunal. And I believe that that violated the U.S. Constitution. That if one right is sacred in this country, it's your right to a fair, free, and public trial. And that overweighed everything else for me. Because I took an oath the very first day I was in Washington, D.C. to defend the U.S. Constitution. And that bill violated it. And so I had to vote no. And every single time I get these bills, I have to weigh that and try to figure out whether it actually complies with what the Constitution says, and then make the best choice I can. Sometimes I choose really good, and sometimes those bills are so close to being a yes or no, and I don't want to vote P. I don't want to just bail on it. I want to make a decision and vote. And you'd be surprised how much your communication in my office means to me. And I hear from you, and I listen to what you're saying and try to get an understanding, grasp of what you're telling me.